right, so we're going to talk a little bit about researching sentencing issues. And primarily in class next week, we're going to do exercises. So this is really just to give you a little bit of background so that when we start doing exercises, you have a sense of where to look and issues to keep in mind as you consider the implications of a sentencing question. So just to give a little bit of context, I have a goofy diagram. Basically, this is where we're going to be talking for the next couple of classes, right? We've gotten to the point where for these modules of the class, a guilty verdict has been handed down, and at this point, your client is going to be sentenced. Though, of course, it can help very early on as well to know how to do sentencing research as you're considering whether or not a plea bargain might be the best way to go. You're advising a client, particularly if you're a defense attorney, you might be advising a client about potential amount of time they're going to spend in prison, looking at alternatives, and so on and so forth. So in terms of where in the context of a criminal case we fall, we're here after a guilty verdict, but in terms of research, these issues could come up quite a bit earlier. And then we'll also talk about the post-conviction remedies and appealing sentences and so on, and convictions. All right, so a few main things to think about from the get-go. One, and we've certainly talked about this before, is know when the crime was committed, right? Because it will be the sentence that was in effect at the time the crime was committed that will be relevant. That being said, and we've talked about this as well, it's important to keep an eye on proposed legislation because particularly in the case of a defense attorney, if the sentence has recently or is in the process of being reduced, that's something that's relevant to know about. Okay. Know the statutory minimum and maximum sentences that are set forth in a statute. Okay. And I'm just going to hop out and show you one thing with regard to that. We've been looking a lot at Massachusetts statutes, and you guys will remember from your assignment, from your graded midterm, and then from other assignments that you've worked on homework-wise, that in Massachusetts you typically have a range, right? Some of the ones you worked on for the Bud and Al conspiracy, attempted murder question for the midterm, you might remember some of the sentences went anywhere from, say, 5 years to life, and it's actually set out in the particular statute that criminalizes the action. I just wanted to show you something slightly different, and we have seen these before too. And you'll notice them in the New York statutory code. Looking at that robbery in the first degree crime, this is the one we looked up the jury instruction for yesterday in class. But you notice for New York and Massachusetts, this would likely give you the range. In New York, it just tells you at the end of the statute that you're working with a Class B felony. Okay, so there's another step here. I think it makes the code more organized, but there is another step where then you need to go look up, okay, well, what's a Class B felony? What's the sentence for a Class B felony? And you ultimately get into this part of the New York Code, right, that talks about sentences of imprisonment. Okay. Click in, look, it talks a little bit about, okay, what are Class B felonies? If you actually read through this, it doesn't give any numbers in terms of months or years, so I went up to the table of contents, and you can see all sorts of sections about sentences of imprisonment. I just backed up and looked at this first one. You can see there have been some recent amendments, so it's giving you the text that's going to be in effect through September 1st of this year and then the text afterwards. But this is when you actually get the numbers, okay? So in some jurisdictions, this is the main point, in some jurisdictions the actual range will be set out in the text of the statute, which is pretty common for Massachusetts. New York is another way of doing it, where in the statute for the particular crime, you get, okay, it's a Class B felony, and then you have to go look elsewhere to see how a Class B felony is sentenced. Okay. All right, so you need to understand the statutory minimums and maximums. You also need to figure out whether the minimum is actually a mandatory minimum. So this gets a little bit confusing because you think, okay, I found a minimum and a maximum. Clearly the minimum is the minimum. Well, that's not always the case. In some instances, a judge would have the discretion to go below the minimum. So an important inquiry is, okay, is that minimum actually mandatory? Does the defendant, if convicted, actually have to serve that amount of time? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. Know if there are sentencing guidelines in your jurisdiction, and if so, where to find them. Okay, we'll talk about what those are and why they're important. Be aware of facts, right? You need to know your defendant's prior history. If the defendant has prior convictions on his record, her record, you need to be aware of those because those can increase a subsequent sentence, right? And a lot of that is set forth in statutes, as you guys have seen in past research problems. Okay, be aware of aggravating and mitigating factors, right? Is there some things say about the victim or the circumstances that make it more serious or less serious? Okay, and then be aware of sentencing alternatives, right? Probation, community service, so on and so forth. For prosecutors and defense attorneys both, it's important to be aware of those alternatives to actually going to a house of corrections or going to state prison. Okay. Again, in terms of finding the actual sentences, statutes are going to be where you go, right? Be aware of notes of decision, interpreting the statutory language, right? We all have learned that statutes only mean what courts say they mean, so just be sure to check those annotations and make sure you understand how the statutory language has been interpreted. Okay, so you have statutes and, of course, interpretive case law, and then you have this new set of research tools called sentencing guidelines, which are basically what they sound like. They're there to guide judges in determining where a particular defendant should be sentenced within a range, right? So as I said, some of the Massachusetts statutes you guys were looking at for that big problem on the midterm had ranges from, say, 5 years to life. So the idea of these guidelines is that you figure out where a particular defendant should fall in that huge range, okay? And I've listed some of the considerations that sentencing guidelines ask judges to take into consideration, right? The seriousness of offense, how injured was the victim, what's the defendant's criminal history, and what other circumstances might lead to a stiffer or more lenient sentence to be appropriate. Okay. One thing that deserves mention here is in the federal landscape, and this certainly affects the state landscape too, the federal sentencing guidelines were mandatory or deemed mandatory for 20 plus years. And there was a big Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Booker, which some of you may be familiar with, that basically said sentencing guidelines cannot be mandatory. They should be advisory only. It's taking power away from the jury, and to insist that judges be able or have to sentence within these guidelines. So just something to keep in mind. Again, case law is very important. Okay, and this can get very complicated, but the idea again is just know where to look, know where to find the guidelines, use your case researching skills, and then of course make use of secondary sources. Okay, so here's some of the main federal and national sources. Okay, so clearly Federal Sentencing Law and Practice, which is available in print and on Westlaw. That's specific to the federal landscape, as is the third one on that list, Federal Sentencing for Business Crimes. Okay, so these are pretty specific federal resources focused on sentencing law. The law of sentencing is one of the biggest national resources, so again, not jurisdiction specific, but can give you a sense of what's going on in the world of sentencing. I would certainly talk about big Supreme Court cases like U.S. v. Booker, and then Apprendi v. New Jersey, which is another big sentencing case that came out of the Supreme Court. And then be aware that general criminal procedure treatises will also talk a lot about sentencing. So this criminal defense techniques would be an example of that. There's also something called a criminal practice manual on Westlaw. It has a great chapter on sentencing. Okay, so you hopefully would be able to find a sentencing specific source, but then just keep in mind the criminal procedure treatises will work as well. Okay, on the state level, statutes are important, interpretive case law, court rules. Be aware, like I said, of whether there are state sentencing guidelines in your jurisdiction. I've given a list to, or a link to the Massachusetts Sentencing Commission where you can find the advisory only, right? Massachusetts sentencing guidelines. And then to the commission in Washington, which handles their sentencing guidelines, again, also advisory. So always keep in mind, are there guidelines? Is there a state-specific guide or treatise in your jurisdiction on sentencing? Most of the time there won't be. We'll take a look. Texas and Ohio actually both have sentencing guidelines or sentencing specific treatises, so we'll take a look at those. Again, a state-specific treatise on criminal procedure would likely have a chapter on sentencing, discuss the landscape within that jurisdiction, and then your general legal encyclopedias. So on the federal level, this would be something like AmJur, and then remember, New York has New York jurisprudence. So something like that, even though it's not a specific criminal related source, they do have volumes that talk about criminal law and criminal procedure, and that would likely include some sort of discussion of the sentencing landscape. Okay. Keep in mind there's a lot of specific terminology that comes up when you're talking about sentencing. So here are just some examples. Google, of course, can be a huge help in getting a sense of what these terms mean. And then, of course, the secondary sources that I've been talking about. One I just wanted to mention in Massachusetts that you hear a lot is called a quaff, or a continuance without a finding. Right? This is, in some ways a sentencing option, but it's really, I suppose, short of that, because there isn't actually a guilty finding or conviction, but a defendant basically says, yeah, I did that. And then the court imposes some sort of conditions. Okay, so just sort of be aware of a very specific vocabulary that exists in this area of the law. A lot of these will be defined by statute, particular to your jurisdiction, secondary sources, and then, like I said, a Google search can often sort of help you get a sense of what a split sentence is, what a suspended sentence is. Okay. And then in class, we'll talk about the federal sentencing guidelines. We'll do this problem at the bottom, so certainly don't worry about that. We'll look at it in class. But the guidelines are freely available online. And like I said, per U.S. v. Booker, they are not mandatory, but rather advisory, though there is authority that says federal judges must consult them. Okay. So we'll look at that in class, and then this last question too. So don't worry about those ahead of time. I'm just going to pull out of the PowerPoint really quickly. Go take a look. Just again, refresh your memories on browsing for sources. So if you were looking for a particular source on sentencing, you could go through and try and see if there's something, a sentencing source specific to your jurisdiction. Like I mentioned, there is one for Texas. The other option is to go and browse by topic. I'm just going to show you guys Lexis.com first. Go to our criminal law link, which we've done before many times. Okay. Our secondary sources. You can sort of skim through. So these are the ones that, some of these are going to be jurisdiction specific, some of them not. You could always go drill down this way. Just to show a couple of examples, you can see Lexis has a source on federal corporate sentencing. So if you wind up doing corporate law, and then here's the Texas one, right? So those are examples of very specific sentencing resources. And then just to show you an example of a more general source that would be helpful, here's a general source on Illinois criminal procedure. And you can see, in addition to many of the other things we've talked about, there's a chapter on sentencing. So make use of those more general sources that will still address this topic. Okay. On Westlaw, go look at Westlaw next. Okay. Again, you could go through and look at your specific jurisdiction, or you could go secondary sources. Look at criminal law, texts and treatises. And again, you just do a Control F. There's a federal sentencing law and practice. This is one I mentioned on my PowerPoint. Law of sentencing. The other one I mentioned, probably the most well-known national source. Practicing under the federal sentencing guidelines. California specific source. Okay. Ohio felony sentencing and so on. Okay. If you're not finding anything specific for your jurisdiction, like if you browse for Massachusetts, just for example, we'll go through. This is where we've been to find mass practice and everything. If you go browse through mass practice, there's not much on sentencing in there. It wasn't particularly helpful. So I just did a broad search in all of the mass secondary sources, wanted to see what would come up. Sentencing. Still not a ton, but actually a really good chapter in one of the MCLE manuals. This is the one we've looked at in class several times, the Massachusetts District Court Criminal Defense Manual. So just to keep in mind all the different tactics you can use. You could browse by jurisdiction, you could browse by topic, and then you could always just run a search for the simple term and see if anything good comes up in the secondary sources. So we will talk about this in more detail in class next Thursday. And in the meantime, as always,